Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. But today, we've got a new tool in the arsenal, essentially to fight misinformation and disinformation online, and that is an AI-powered troll spotter that found something rather interesting. Now, here's what's going on, and I want to dive into this because traditional approaches to spotting problematic online behavior typically have relied historically on two different methods. One is to examine the content, essentially what they're saying, and the other is to analyze network connections, who follows whom, etc., etc. But these have always had limitations. Users can circumvent content analysis. They may code their language carefully or share misleading information without using obvious trigger words. I had an entire video on this a while back on AlgoSpeak specifically about that. Network analysis also falls short on platforms such as Reddit because it doesn't act and behave in a way that like a Twitter would, right? So the connections between users aren't necessarily explicit on those types of platforms. So communities are organized around topics rather than social relationships on that platform. And this is where we start really getting interesting because Marian-Andre Riziu, he's an associate professor in behavioral data science at the University of Technology, Sydney, and his team wanted to find a way to identify harmful actors that could not basically be easily gamed, meaning they would have a hard time gaming the system. And so they realized they could actually do that by focusing on the behavior, i.e., how people are interacting rather than what they're actually saying. And so their approach used a technique called inverse reinforcement learning. Now, this method is typically used to understand human decision making in fields like autonomous driving, game theory, all this kind of stuff. And so they adapted that technology to analyze how users behave on social media platforms. Now, the system works by observing a user's actions, such as creating new threads on Reddit, posting comments, replying to others, etc., etc. And from those actions, it infers the underlying strategy or policy that drives this particular person's behavior. So, in the Reddit case study that they did, they analyzed 5.9 million interactions over 6 years. And by virtue of that, they identified 5 distinct behavioral personas, including one particularly notable group that we're going to be focusing on here today in this segment called the disagreeers. And this is, I think, a really interesting look into how Reddit and humans operate. This entire class of Reddit users whose primary purpose basically seems to be to just disagree with everybody else. These users specifically seek out opportunities to post contradictory comments, especially in response to disagreement, and then move on without waiting for replies. I've actually seen that in my own social media on things like YouTube, where I get somebody that just disagrees, and then I might respond because I try to interact as best I can, although I'm always behind on that kind of stuff. And oftentimes I don't get responses from those kinds of people. I would argue that I probably have disagreeers on my social media, as probably many do, right? So these disagreeers, for the record, were most common in politically focused subreddits, such as r/news, r/world news, and r/politics. And again, we are not getting into politics. You know my preamble on all this kind of stuff, but this is where they are hanging out, as well as other places as well. Interestingly, though, they were much less common in pro-Trump groups. Now, there was a banned group on Reddit called r/the Donald, _Donald, despite its political focus. And that's really interesting because it reveals how behavioral analysis can uncover dynamics that content analysis misses. So, for example, in that r/the Donald thread, users tended to agree with each other while directing hostility towards outside targets. This is very classic in-group, out-group political thinking, and that dynamic may explain why traditional content moderation has struggled to address problems in these communities. And that's essentially what it is. Right? I mean, and I think that's really interesting. If you're basically in a forum that's pro Donald Trump, odds are, unless you're just there to throw grenades, in comments, most everybody is going to agree because they're all going to support Donald Trump. Conversely, if you've got an anti-Donald Trump thread on Reddit as well, it's going to be the same thing. So their research also revealed unexpected connections. Users discussing completely different topics sometimes displayed remarkably similar behavioral patterns. So they found really interesting similarities between users that were discussing soccer and also users that were discussing esports like League of Legends. So this really emerges from the fundamental nature of both communities because soccer and esports fans both engage in parallel ways. They passionately support their team, they follow matches with intense interest, they participate in heated discussions about strategies and performance, victories, defeats, all this kind of stuff, right? Both communities then fosters strong tribal identities in the same way that if you've got a very pro-political something on one side of the spectrum or the other, you're building that tribe. Users defend their favorite teams, they critique rivals, and on and on. But the implications of this research go well beyond just the academic interest here. Platform moderators could use behavioral patterns in these techniques to identify potentially problematic users before they've posted large volumes of harmful content. Think about those people that just go in and throw the grenade and, let everybody go wild as they've riled up the internal tribe of that thread. Unlike content moderation, behavioral analysis does not depend on understanding language. So it is hard to evade since changing one's behavior patterns requires more effort than adjusting language. In other words, I can basically adjust how I type intentionally by thinking about a new approach to, let's say, writing a sentence or even talking to you here. I can adjust it on the fly, but my behavioral patterns are inherent to who I am. It takes much more effort and focus to actually change those. Therefore, statistically speaking, I'm going to have a much harder time evading them. Now, the approach could also help design more effective strategies to counter misinformation, because rather than relying solely on the content, they can then design systems that encourage more constructive engagement patterns while identifying those that would be basically peeing in the digital pool. So, for social media users, this research offers a reminder that how we engage online, not just what we say, shapes our digital identity and therefore influences others. And so we've got a huge issue with this because online platforms continue to have issues with manipulation, harassment, polarization. And so approaches that consider behavioral patterns alongside content analysis may offer, quite frankly, I don't necessarily know if it's a silver bullet, but vastly more effective moderation of essentially those that would be throwing these grenades, meaning the disinformation peddlers of the world. So I think it's interesting. I'm very curious to see, real life examples of this beyond just the analysis side of Reddit to see how this would work on a Facebook. Not that the Facebooks of the world are moderating content anymore. They've been slashing their trust and safety teams. But nevertheless, we have a new tool in the arsenal that I think these platforms should be adopting. And again, it's not about the content, it's about the behavior of the user that starts flagging them. And so I think it's interesting. I'm very curious to see, where this goes. And hopefully sooner than later, we're going to start having this analysis again alongside the content analysis as well. And best of luck to us all online. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private, secure, and informed. Take care.